The slave gave birth to her master's child, but the baby's deformity revealed his darkest sin. The scream tore through the Georgia night so sharply that even the pine trees seemed to shudder. It was March of 1853 on the Thornhill plantation, a stretch of worn red earth and cotton fields that rolled beneath a heavy, starless sky. In the slave quarters, most people had already sunk into the uneasy sleep that comes after too many hours of labor. But in the last cabin at the far edge of the row, a lantern still burned, its dim light fighting against the dark. Inside, Esther lay on a straw pallet, clutching a sweat-soaked sheet in both hands. She was 23, her face still young but lined with the kind of fatigue that does not come from work alone. Her knees were drawn up, her breath coming in ragged gasps that shook her whole body. "Push, child," Mama Ruth urged, leaning over her. The old midwife's hair was more gray than black now, wrapped in a faded kerchief. Her hands, calloused and sure, had coaxed more babies into this world than she could count. "You gotta push. You hear me? Don't you give up now." Esther had been pushing for hours. The contractions came in waves that swallowed everything else. Sound, light, thought. Between them she floated in a fog of pain and exhaustion, but each time another wave hit, it dragged her back down, demanding more strength than she had to give. Her fingernails dug into the sheet. Sweat stung her eyes. "I can't," she gasped. "I can't, Mama Ruth. I'm too tired." "You ain't tired," Mama Ruth snapped, her voice firm but not unkind. "You alive. That baby's alive. Now push." Thunder rumbled far off in the distance, a low growl that never quite became a storm. The cabin smelled of blood, sweat, and the bitter tang of the herbs Mama Ruth had boiled on the small iron stove. Shadows flickered on the rough wooden walls. Another contraction gripped Esther like a vice. She screamed again, the sound raw and hoarse, and bore down with everything she had left. Her vision blurred. Her ears rang. The world narrowed to the pressure. The burn, the terrible tearing force that felt as if the earth itself was splitting inside her. Then, all at once, it was over. Mama Ruth's hands moved quickly. There was a wet, slick sensation, a rush of warmth, and then the weight lifted from Esther's body. Somewhere in the haze, she heard the midwife's tired voice. "It's out. The baby's out." The room should have filled with a newborn cry then, that thin, fierce sound that announces life even to those who would rather not hear it. Instead, silence dropped over them like a heavy curtain. Esther blinked, struggling to focus. "Why ain't he crying?" she whispered. "Why can't I hear him?" Mama Ruth did not answer at once. She held the baby in her hands, her brow furrowing, her mouth working as if she wanted to speak, but the words would not come. The lantern light trembled across the small, wet body. "Ruth," Esther said, fear sliding like ice into her chest. "Let me see my baby." "Hold on," Mama Ruth murmured. "Just a moment now." "Let me see him," Esther insisted, trying to push herself up on shaking elbows. Her whole body throbbed, but a different kind of pain was taking over now, sharp and cold. Slowly, as though her arms had grown heavy with stones, Mama Ruth wrapped the baby in a thin cloth and brought him over. When she laid the bundle in Esther's arms, the young woman's breath caught. The baby's head was too large for his narrow shoulders, the skull swollen and misshapen. His eyes sat wider apart than they should, lids fluttering weakly. His mouth gaped open, the upper lip and palate split by a jagged seam that had never come together. His arms and legs were small, twisted, not lying straight the way they ought to. He made a faint, strangled sound. Not quite a cry, more like a broken attempt at one, and then fell back into an uneasy silence. Esther stared, her heart lurching between love and horror. He's mine," she whispered, tears spilling down her temples. "He's my baby. My boy." Mama Ruth sank to her knees beside the pallet, her old bones creaking. She made the sign of the cross in the air without thinking, her hand trembling. "Lord have mercy," she breathed. Lord have mercy. What's wrong with him? Esther asked, voice shaking. Tell me the truth. Mama Ruth hesitated. She had seen babies born too early, born too small, born too weak to live. She had seen stillbirths and fevers and grief, but she had rarely seen a child like this, so marked as if his very flesh carried a story that could not be hidden. Some babies, she began carefully, they come into this world carrying more than their own burden. Sometimes they carry the weight of what was done before them. Esther's grip tightened around the tiny, fragile body. Her mind raced back over months she had tried not to remember, over nights she had forced herself to forget. The smell of whiskey on a white man's breath, the press of boots on creaking boards, a voice that said mine as if it were a blessing instead of a curse. Deep in her bones, she already knew. Mama Ruth looked at her with tired, sorrowful eyes. This child, she said softly, ain't just sick. He's a sign of a sin that goes deeper than one body, deeper than one birth. A sin in the blood itself. Esther pulled the baby closer to her chest, her tears falling on his swollen forehead. He's innocent, she whispered fiercely. Whatever sin there is, it ain't his. I know, child, Mama Ruth said, but the man who put him in your belly, he ain't innocent. Not by a long mile. The wind outside rattled the cabin door. Somewhere farther off, a watchman's lantern bobbed along the row, its light cutting briefly through the cracks in the walls. Esther held her son and understood, with a clarity sharper than any pain, that this night would change everything. The child in her arms was not only her baby, he was proof. But to understand why his twisted little body carried such a terrible truth, we have to step back from this dark March night on Thornhill and return to the day his mother's story really began. Before we go back in time, let me ask you, where are you listening from tonight? To understand what happened the night Esther's child entered the world without a cry, we must travel back nearly a quarter of a century to the year 1829, when the Thornhill plantation was at the height of its wealth and cruelty. The plantation stretched over thousands of acres of Georgia soil, a place where the earth itself seemed hardened by the footsteps of those who worked it. During the summers, heat shimmered above the cotton rows like a dance of invisible fire. In winter, the air bit through thin clothing and frost crept into cabins with no insulation to stop it. The big house, Thornhill Hall, rose above this landscape like a polished monument to a family name that had been built on the backs of others. In those days, the plantation belonged to Colonel James Thornhill, a man not yet 40, proud of his military title and prouder still of the land he owned. His reputation in the county was solid. A gentleman, a father of 2 boys, and a respected landowner. But behind the closed doors of Thornhill Hall, the man's character carried shadows his neighbors never saw, or pretended not to see. Sarah, just 16, lived among those shadows. She was born on the plantation to a woman named Dinah, who had died when Sarah was still a child. By the age of 12, Sarah had been brought into the big house to serve as a house girl. She polished floors, washed linens, tended fires, and carried water up the long staircase until her arms burned. The mistress of the house, Eleanor Thornhill, demanded perfection. A wrinkle in the tablecloth, a smudge on the silver, a footstep too loud, each earned punishment. Sarah learned early to move like silence itself. She grew into her beauty slowly, the way the magnolia blossoms grow, cautiously unfurling in the heat of spring. Her skin was smooth as river stone, her eyes dark and watchful. Her hair, thick and coiled, glowed chestnut in the sun when she dared step outside during daylight hours. And beauty, on a plantation, was often more dangerous than it was useful. Colonel Thornhill noticed her before his wife did. His eyes lingered on her too long, his questions about her chores were too probing, his compliments too warmly spoken for a man who should have treated her as mere property. Sarah felt his attention like a heat on the back of her neck, and learned to keep herself small, to make herself invisible whenever possible. But on Thornhill Plantation, invisibility was a fragile defense. One evening, as rain pattered against the windows and thunder rolled across the hills, Sarah was sent to bring a tray of warm brandy to the Colonel's study. It was a room filled with dark wood, maps of old battles, and the smell of tobacco. The door closed behind her with a soft thud that made her heart beat faster. He turned toward her, standing before the fire. The light cast his face in sharp angles. "Set it on the table, Sarah," he said. She did, her hands steady only because she had learned to hide every tremor. "Stay a moment," he added. She froze. "Sir, Mistress Eleanor told me." "I said stay." His voice was calm. Too calm. Sarah's pulse throbbed loudly in her ears as he stepped toward her. His fingers brushed her cheek, a touch that made her flinch as if from a hot stove. "You're a beautiful girl," he murmured. "Your mother was beautiful too." Sarah swallowed hard. "Sir, please, I should go." "You belong to me," he said. "You know that." And with those words, the truth settled like a stone in her stomach. What happened next was not soft. It was not gentle. It was not love, no matter what the Colonel would claim in his later years. It was an act of power, carried out behind a locked door, with no witness except the fire burning low in the hearth. Sarah left the study that night with her dress torn and her spirit bruised, her steps shaky as she descended the staircase. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears were a luxury few on the plantation could afford. But she carried the memory with her, a weight that lodged deep in her bones. 9 months later, when she went into labor during a humid August dawn, Mama Ruth helped deliver a baby girl. The infant's skin was lighter than Sarah's, her curls looser, and when she opened her eyes, they were the unmistakable shade of the Colonel's own, pale blue like washed-out sky. No one said the truth aloud. No one had to. The mistress of the house turned her face away in disgust. The Colonel looked at the child only once, but some part of him recognized her. He named her Esther, a name from Scripture, a name he claimed represented beauty and destiny. Perhaps he said it to ease his conscience, or perhaps to pretend nobility where none existed. Sarah loved her daughter with a fierceness that surprised even her. She shielded the girl from the worst of plantation life, taught her to work hard, speak little, and observe everything. But love, no matter how powerful, could not stop the realities surrounding them. Sarah never told Esther who her father was. Perhaps she hoped it would spare the girl pain. Perhaps she feared the Colonel's wrath if the truth slipped. Or perhaps she carried shame that was not hers to carry. But secrecy has a way of coming undone. And when Sarah died when Esther was just 15, the girl was left alone with nothing but whispers. Whispers that would soon lead her straight into the same darkness her mother once endured. The year Sarah died, Thornhill Plantation felt different. Quieter in a way that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the absence of a woman who had once been its unseen center. Esther felt that absence every morning before dawn, when she rose from her pallet and reached instinctively for a voice, a touch, a reassurance that was no longer there. Without Sarah, Esther's world shrank. Her place in the quarters felt hollow. The older women tried to comfort her, but grief carved its own space inside her chest. For months, she avoided the big house except when absolutely ordered. She kept to the fields, bent low among the cotton rows, where she could disappear among countless others who labored under the burning Georgia sun. But 16-year-old beauty was hard to hide for long, especially from the man who had once taken everything from her mother. Colonel James Thornhill noticed Esther again before autumn came. He saw her from the veranda one morning while she carried a bucket of fresh water toward the curing barn. The angle of her face caught him first, the long line of her cheek, the way her hair curled softly against her neck. She wiped her brow with the back of her hand, unaware of his gaze. Something in him stirred. Or perhaps something old inside him simply reawakened. When he asked one of the house servants her name, the woman hesitated before answering. Everyone on the plantation knew who Esther was, knew the truth Sarah had taken to her grave. But the colonel had spent years pretending the truth was a thing that could be swallowed whole and forgotten. "Esther," the servant said quietly. "Sarah's girl." The colonel nodded, though the words did not fully sink in. A few days later, he summoned Esther to the big house. The message arrived through Mrs. Turner, the steward, who gave Esther a thin-lipped look that held both contempt and warning. "The colonel wants you inside," she said. "Now, smooth your apron, and don't speak unless spoken to." Esther's stomach tightened into a cold knot. She followed the woman through the long hallway, past the portraits of Thornhill ancestors with their powdered wigs and solemn faces, past the parlor where the mistress of the house sat sewing with trembling hands. Mistress Eleanor glanced up as Esther passed. Her eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but with weary dread. Esther wondered if the woman knew, truly knew, the sins her husband had committed. Perhaps she did. Perhaps she chose to look away, as so many others did. When she reached the colonel's study, he dismissed Mrs. Turner and closed the door behind them. "Esther," he said, leaning against the desk as though he wanted to appear gentle, "you've grown since I last saw you." She kept her gaze on the floor. "Yes, sir. You remind me of your mother," he continued. "Sarah was a lovely woman, a quiet one. She had grace." Esther stayed silent, her breath tight in her ribs. She remembered her mother's warnings. Stay away from the big house. Stay away from the colonel. Stay away from the places where men with power can reach you. But the big house had called her inside anyway, and the colonel was stepping closer. "I think it's time you worked here again," he said. "In the house. Your mother did fine work. There's no reason her daughter shouldn't." The words were not a suggestion. Esther nodded. She had no choice. For 2 weeks, she worked in the kitchen, then the laundry, then the sewing room. She kept her head down, but she could feel the colonel's eyes on her whenever he passed by. At meals, he watched her carry trays. In the evenings, he lingered near the stairs when she swept them, pretending to read a newspaper while observing her every move. The night it happened, the house was unusually still. The second son had returned to college. The first was traveling on business. Mistress Eleanor had retired early with a headache. The servants moved quietly through their tasks. A storm gathered outside, thunder rolling low across the distant hills. Esther had just finished folding linens when she heard footsteps behind her. Heavy, familiar. "Esther," the colonel said softly. She stiffened, her fingers slipping from the cloth. "Sir, I was just—" "Hush," he said. "You don't have to fear me." But she did. Her whole body trembled with the memory of stories she had overheard, with the fear her mother had tried to shield her from. She stepped back, but he followed. "You're a beautiful girl," he murmured, the same words he once told Sarah. "Just like your mother." "Please," she whispered. "Please, sir, let me go." But power, once indulged, rarely grows softer. And monsters, once awakened, rarely go back to sleep. What unfolded that night mirrored the nightmare from 24 years before, except now the victim was not a house girl with no one to protect her. It was the daughter of the woman Thornhill once violated, a daughter he claimed he did not recognize. Afterward, Esther moved like a stunned animal, her body aching, her mind wrapped in a confusion of shame and disbelief. She told no one at first. The weight of what had been done to her, again in the same house, by the same man, pressed down until she could barely breathe. But the truth has a way of showing itself, whether spoken or not. A month later, when Esther began to feel sick each morning, Mama Ruth studied her closely. The older woman's eyes took in the signs: fatigue, nausea, the way Esther held her stomach when she thought no one was looking. "Child," Mama Ruth whispered, Tell me who did this to you." Esther tried to speak, but her throat closed. Tears welled in her eyes. Mama Ruth cupped her face tenderly. "Lord help us," she sighed. "It's him, ain't it?" Esther nodded. Mama Ruth let out a long, mourning sound. The same devil done it twice in one lifetime. The old woman sank onto a stool, her hands trembling. "Your mama fought her whole life to keep you away from that man. And now—" She shook her head. Esther finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm carrying his child." Mama Ruth looked up, her expression torn between fury and sorrow. "No," she said softly. "You're carrying more than that. You're carrying the proof of everything Sarah died afraid of." And she was right, because the life growing inside Esther's womb did not come only from violence. It came from bloodlines twisted together by sin. And the day that child entered the world, deformed, fragile, silent, the truth Thornhill had buried for decades would rise like a ghost he could no longer outrun. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Colonel James Thornhill pushed open the door of the cabin where Esther lay with her newborn son. Dawn spilled in behind him, pale and cold, washing over the cramped room like a judgment. He entered expecting triumph. He expected the pride of a man greeting an heir. He expected to see a child who resembled him, strong, healthy, a testament to his bloodline. What he found instead made his face drain of color. Mama Ruth moved instinctively between him and the pallet, as though her small bent frame could shield mother and child. But the colonel brushed past her, his boots scraping across the wooden floor. "What is that?" he demanded, his voice cracking like a whip in the quiet morning. Esther held the child close, her arms trembling but firm. The baby stirred weakly, his breathing shallow and uneven. "This is your son," she whispered. The colonel stepped back as though the infant had teeth. No, that," he pointed with a shaking finger. "That thing is not mine." Mama Ruth closed her eyes and murmured something under her breath, a prayer or perhaps a plea. Esther did not look away from the colonel. "You asked for a son," she said. "You told me I belonged to you. You said this child would carry your name." He stared at the baby, horror twisting his features. The misshapen head, the fragile limbs, the cleft in his lip, the strange stillness in his eyes. "This is witchcraft," he snapped. "Some curse. Some hex." "This is no curse," Mama Ruth said quietly. "This child was born the way he was made." "He ain't mine," the colonel said again, voice rising. "He can't be. None of my children were ever born like this. None." Esther's eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. "Maybe because none of them were born the way this child was conceived." The colonel froze. For a moment, time thickened in the room, pressing down like humidity before a storm. "Explain yourself," he said, though his face already showed the beginnings of dread. Esther took a breath so deep it trembled through her entire body. "My mother," she said, "was Sarah." The colonel blinked, as if he'd heard a sound from far away. "You know who she was?" Esther continued. "You know what you did to her in this very house. Everyone on this plantation knows." His jaw clenched. "Watch yourself, girl." "I am," Esther said, lifting her chin. "I've been watching you my whole life." Mama Ruth stepped back, leaving space for the words that could no longer remain unsaid. "You violated my mother," Esther said softly. "And 9 months later, I was born with your eyes, your skin, your blood." "Lies," the colonel whispered. "You looked at me when I was little," Esther continued, her voice calm but cutting. "You looked at me the same way you looked at her. And when she died, when no one was left to stop you, you came to me." The colonel's breathing faltered. "You knew," Esther said. "Somewhere deep down you knew. That's why you never asked who my father was. That's why you never let Mistress Eleanor teach me letters in the house. That's why you kept me in the fields until you couldn't resist repeating what you had done before." The colonel staggered back a step, his hand reaching for the wall as if the room were tilting. "And now," Esther said, lifting her son slightly so the dawn light fell across his twisted features, "the truth is written on this child's body. This is what happens when a man sins against his own blood. You didn't just violate a woman this time, you violated your daughter." "No," he choked. "No, that's not—" "This baby," Esther said, "is your son and your grandson." Mama Ruth let out a low, guttural sound, half sorrow, half fury, as the truth hung suspended in the air. For a long moment, no one moved. The colonel stared at the infant, his face stark with horror, not at the cruelty he had committed, but at the stain it now left on his name. Sweat beaded at his temples. His breath came fast, shallow. "What do you want?" he rasped. "Money? Favor? Protection?" Esther closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength. "I want you to look at your sin," she said. "Not turn away from it, not bury it. Look at what you have done." The colonel's hand curled into a fist. "Kill it," he whispered. "Kill that thing now, and we will never speak of this again." Esther shielded the baby with her body. "I will not let you harm him. You don't command anything here," he roared. "You are mine." "No," Esther said, her voice suddenly firm as stone. "I was never yours, and this child is not yours to erase." The man who had ruled Thornhill Plantation for 30 years looked suddenly small, trapped in a cage of his own making. His breath grew ragged. He reached for the door frame to steady himself. "You don't understand," he sputtered. "If anyone finds out—" "They will," Esther said simply. "And when they do, the shame will be yours to carry. Not mine, not his." The colonel looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time in his life saw not a servant, not a possession, but a force that could not be controlled. He stepped back from the pallet, his face gray and tight. "If you speak a word of this," he said, voice trembling, "I will destroy you." Esther held her son closer. "You already tried," she whispered. "And still I am here." The door slammed behind him. Outside, the first light of sunrise crept over the fields, touching the earth with a quiet warmth. Inside the cabin, Esther rocked her fragile child and finally allowed herself to cry. Not out of fear, but out of the terrible truth that had finally come into the open. Before we turn to the consequences of this revelation, let me ask you, word travels differently on a plantation. It does not move through newspapers, nor through polite conversation over porcelain teacups. It travels through glances, through the shift of shoulders in the fields, through the soft knock on a cabin door after sundown. And once a truth begins to move that way, no amount of force can hold it back. Within a single day, every enslaved person at Thornhill knew what had happened inside Esther's birthing cabin. And within 2 days, the whispers had reached the kitchens of the big house. By the end of the week, the overseer, who had lived long enough to read scandal in the wind, began avoiding the colonel's eyes. But the colonel was not avoiding anyone's eyes. He was avoiding mirrors. The man who once strode across his land with the confidence of a king now moved like a hunted creature, shoulders drawn, eyes darting. Shame, when it finally reached him, hit harder than bullets. It struck at the one thing he valued more than land, more than wealth, more than even his own children, his reputation. He tried to bury the truth. First, he threatened Mama Ruth. She met his fury with silence. Then he threatened the overseer, who gave a stiff nod, but quickly realized threats could not silence an entire plantation. Finally, he tried to pressure Esther into giving up the child. He leaned close to her one night when she was sitting outside the cabin, rocking Samuel gently as the moonlight pooled at her feet. "You can leave all this behind," the colonel said, his voice soft in a way that made her skin crawl. "Give the child to me. I'll see him placed somewhere. Discreet. No one needs to know." Esther kept rocking, her eyes on the baby's fragile face. "No," she said. "You don't understand," he hissed. "If anyone believes your story, if anyone believes that child is mine, my name will be ruined. My sons will never inherit respect, never marry into good families, never raise their children without the shadow of this shame." Esther looked up at him then, her gaze steady. "I am not the one who brought shame," she said. "You did." He struck the porch beam beside her head, splintering the wood. "You will regret this." She did not flinch. "I already have." He left in a rage, and the sound of his boots faded into the night. Esther continued rocking Samuel long after he had gone, feeling each movement echo through her bones. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the voices of those who had lived and suffered before her. Even the moon seemed to watch, pale and silent. 2 days later, the first outsider heard the story. It happened in the most ordinary way. A traveling merchant, who often brought fabrics and tools to the plantation, stopped at the kitchen door for a glass of water. One servant, thinking the merchant already knew, murmured a comment about the colonel's devil's child. The merchant left with the story burning in his ears, not daring to ask details. By the time he reached the next plantation, he shared the rumor in confidence. But rumors do not stay still. They spread like spilled ink, seeping into every crease of society. Within a week, 3 plantations knew. Within 2, whispers had reached the church choir. By the 3rd, even the county judge had sent his clerk to casually inquire whether all was well at Thornhill. The colonel responded with paranoia. He tightened discipline on the plantation. He assigned armed guards near the cabins at night. He ordered Esther to remain indoors unless working. He even visited the local sheriff, a close friend, and insisted he arrest Mama Ruth for witchcraft. The sheriff refused, wary of becoming entangled in scandal, and as the pressure mounted, something inside the enslaved community shifted. Men and women who had lived for decades under the harsh rule of Thornhill now looked at him with a new understanding. The man who had held power over them was broken, and fear had hollowed him. Revolutions begin in the smallest cracks of the old world. The first crack came when Abigail, one of the field workers, refused to lower her eyes when the colonel passed by. He raised his hand to strike her, but something in her calm gaze stopped him cold. He dropped his hand. 2 days later, an older man named Ezra confronted the overseer about working conditions. The overseer, usually brutal with his whip, hesitated. The power he once held no longer seemed absolute. And in the cabins, after sundown, men and women gathered in hushed circles, their voices trembling not with fear, but with possibility. For the first time, the idea of resistance, real physical resistance, began to take form. Esther did not lead these gatherings, but her story fueled them. The people looked at her and saw a woman who had faced the master and lived. They saw a child who embodied the truth of what had been done to them for generations, a truth the colonel could not hide. But Esther had no desire for bloodshed. She wanted only to protect her son. In the early evenings, she walked the edge of the cotton fields, whispering prayers under her breath, asking for strength, for wisdom, for mercy. Yet mercy was not coming to Thornhill Plantation. Not anymore. On a warm April night, the tipping point arrived. It began with the colonel drinking far more than usual. The whiskey loosened what little sense he had left, and as midnight fell, he stormed across the yard toward Esther's cabin. He beat on the door with the side of his fist, shouting her name. "Open this door, girl. You hear me? Open it now." Esther, who had just settled Samuel after a difficult evening of crying, froze. "Stay quiet," Mama Ruth whispered from her chair. "Don't let him rile you." But the colonel was beyond reason. He forced the latch with a violent shove, sending splinters flying. He stepped inside, swaying slightly, the lantern he carried casting wild shadows across the walls. "I warned you," he growled. "I warned you what would happen if you kept talking, if you kept that creature alive." Esther stood between him and the pallet, her body shaking but unmovable. "You can kill me," she said, her voice low, "but you cannot kill the truth." He lunged toward her. Before he reached her, two men burst into the cabin, Ezra and a younger man named Luke. They had been keeping watch outside, knowing the colonel's temper, knowing the danger Esther lived under each night. They grabbed the colonel by the arms, pinning him back. "What is this?" he roared. "You dare lay hands on me? You dare touch your master?" "You ain't a master tonight," Ezra said quietly. "You a man trying to kill a woman, and that ain't right in the eyes of God." The colonel thrashed wildly, screaming threats, but the men dragged him outside. A crowd had formed in the yard, men, women, children, drawn from their cabins by the commotion. For the first time in his life, Colonel Thornhill stood surrounded by the people he had controlled for decades, and none of them bowed their heads. The night air pulsed with a strange electricity, something sacred and dangerous, something long delayed. Esther stepped out of the cabin, holding Samuel tightly against her chest. The lantern light flickered across her face, revealing the exhaustion of childbirth, the weeks of fear, but also a hardness that had not been there before, a hardness shaped by truth. "This man," she said, speaking to the gathered crowd, "hurt my mother. He hurt me, and now he wants to hurt my child." A murmur rippled through the group. Even those who had not known the full story felt the weight of her words. Ezra looked down at the colonel, whose rage had begun to shift into terror. "What you reckon we do with a man like that, Miss Esther?" Miss Esther, a title reserved not for slaves, but for women of dignity. She hesitated. In another world, she might have called for justice or mercy or perhaps even vengeance. But she looked at her son, small, fragile, struggling for breath, and realized no punishment she could name would undo what had already been done. She spoke softly, but her words carried through the yard. "Let him live." The crowd gasped. "Let him live," she repeated. "Let him carry his shame. Let every man he meets know what he did. Let every woman turn her face from him. Let his own sons refuse his name. Let him live long enough to understand that power cannot save him now." Ezra nodded slowly. They released the colonel, who stumbled backward, falling into the dirt. He stared at Esther as if seeing her for the first time. Seeing not a servant, not a possession, but the force that had undone him, he scrambled away, muttering curses under his breath, retreating into the darkness of the yard. By morning, all of Georgia would know what had happened at Thornhill, because shame travels as quickly as truth, and this truth burned brighter than any flame. The old world had cracked. Something new was beginning to rise. The morning after the confrontation, Thornhill Plantation felt strangely quiet, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. The air was still. Even the birds seemed cautious. Something had shifted in the darkness the night before, something too large to name. Everyone felt it. Colonel Thornhill did not emerge from the big house. Curtains were drawn across every window, shutting out the daylight. There were no orders from the porch, no horse hooves on the gravel path, no sound of boots pacing the halls. The overseer, uncertain and suddenly without direction, kept his distance. The enslaved men and women continued their work with an odd mixture of fear and freedom. Fear because the rules of their world had been shaken. Freedom because for the first time, the man who held the whip seemed afraid of them. Through it all, Esther stayed close to her son. Samuel's breathing remained soft and uneven. His chest rose and fell with fragile rhythms, each breath a quiet battle. But he clung to life with a determination that felt ancient, as though he carried within him not only his mother's will, but the will of countless others who had come before them. Mama Ruth visited daily, bringing herbs, warm cloths, prayers whispered into the soft curls of the baby's head. "This child's spirit is strong," she murmured, "stronger than his little body lets on." Esther listened, equal parts comforted and frightened. Every morning she prayed Samuel would survive the day. Every night she prayed he would survive the night. Days stretched into weeks. During that time, the outside world came knocking. The story of Colonel Thornhill's shame had traveled further than anyone expected. It reached the ears of abolitionist groups in the North, men and women who had been fighting slavery through newspapers, meetings, and church movements. Among them was Reverend Henry Bradford, a stern but gentle man known for his relentless pursuit of truth. He arrived at Thornhill Plantation in late June, dressed in plain clothes, his expression grave. His presence on Southern soil was dangerous. Abolitionists were not welcomed visitors in Georgia. Esther watched from her cabin doorway as he approached the big house. He knocked 3 times. It took nearly 5 minutes before someone answered. The colonel did not appear. Instead, the overseer stepped out, his face stiff as he told the Reverend that no interviews would be granted. Reverend Bradford accepted the refusal, but as he turned to leave, a group of enslaved men and women gathered near the edge of the yard. They had heard whispers of men like him, men who believed their lives had value, men who dared speak truth in places where truth was unwelcome. "Reverend," Ezra said quietly, "you ought to talk to Miss Esther." Bradford stopped. When he saw Esther standing in the cabin doorway, holding her frail child, something in his eyes changed. He approached slowly, respectfully, and asked if she wished to speak freely. Esther glanced toward the big house, where curtains still hung like a barricade. The man who had ruled her life for so long no longer seemed to exist beyond those walls. "Yes," she said. They sat beneath the shade of a pecan tree. Esther told her story, her mother, Sarah, the colonel's violence, her childhood, her fear, the night he came for her, Samuel's birth, and the truth carved into her son's body. She spoke steadily, without embellishment, letting each fact settle like heavy stones between them. Reverend Bradford's hands trembled slightly as he listened. When she finished, he closed his eyes and whispered a prayer. "Your story," he said, "must be told to the world, not to shame you, never that, but to show the cruelty this system breeds. You have borne a burden no human being should bear." Esther stroked Samuel's tiny hand. "I'm tired," she admitted. "Tired of hiding, tired of fear." "Then let us help you," the Reverend said. "Let us help your son." The following morning, he returned with 2 other abolitionists, a schoolteacher named Martha Winslow and a young doctor, Jacob Whitfield. They examined Samuel, spoke quietly with Mama Ruth, and made an offer that seemed impossible. "We want to purchase your freedom," Martha said gently. "Yours and your child's. We have the funds, and we can take you north, where you can live in safety." The words felt unreal. Freedom. It was a dream whispered in songs, in prayers, in stories told in low voices after midnight. But an offer like this could cost a person their life. If it angered the colonel, if he lashed out, blood could be spilled. Still, when Reverend Bradford asked Esther if she wanted to go, she answered without hesitation. "Yes," she said, "I want my son to live free." The negotiations took 3 days. Colonel Thornhill, once a man of iron power, appeared brittle and unsteady when he finally emerged. His hair hung disheveled, his eyes hollow as if the scandal had eaten away at something vital inside him. He sold Esther and Samuel for a fraction of their market value. He did not look Esther in the eye. Perhaps he couldn't bear to. Perhaps he had finally understood the weight of what he had done. Or perhaps he was simply broken. On the morning Esther left Thornhill, the enslaved community gathered quietly near the wagon to see her off. Ezra pressed a small wooden carving into her hand, a little bird with outstretched wings. "For protection," he said. Mama Ruth kissed Samuel's forehead and whispered, "You gon' fly, child. Higher than any of us ever did." Esther climbed onto the wagon with tears in her eyes. As they rolled down the long dirt road away from the plantation, the fields passed like memories. She did not look back. The road north was long. There were dangers, slave catchers, informants, lawmen, but abolitionist networks guided them from safe house to safe house. Reverend Bradford traveled with them part of the way. Martha Winslow taught Esther basic reading and writing around campfires. Dr. Whitfield showed her how to care for Samuel's medical needs, and Esther, for the first time in her life, felt something like hope. They arrived in Philadelphia on a crisp October morning. The city was a world unlike anything Esther had known. For the first time, she walked streets without fear of a master's eyes on her back. She found work as a caregiver at a church-run infirmary. Samuel received care from doctors who treated him with dignity, not revulsion. The child lived 12 years, longer than anyone expected. Each year a gift Esther cherished fiercely. When Samuel passed away, she held him as she had the day he was born, whispering the same promise. "You are loved. Every moment." Esther lived on for decades, becoming a respected figure in abolitionist circles, giving testimony, speaking in churches, and helping women who faced abuse. Those who heard her never forgot her quiet strength or the depth of her sorrow. In 1889, at the age of 59, Esther passed peacefully in her sleep. She was buried beside Samuel in a small cemetery shaded by oak trees. Her gravestone read, "She carried truth through fire, and the world changed because she spoke." And in the South, long after Colonel Thornhill died in disgrace, people still whispered about the woman who had broken a man's legacy with nothing but courage, endurance, and a child who revealed the darkest sin of his life. Before we close this chapter for good, let me ask, where are you listening to this story from tonight?